The night was colder than he remembered, a kind of Boston chill that settled not just on the skin, but deeper in the bones where loneliness sometimes lived. Daniel Carter walked down the quiet street with only $50 folded neatly in his pocket, money meant for emergencies, but tonight transformed into something braver, a chance at beginning again. He knew it was foolish to spend what was set aside for bills, for his little girl's shoes, for the next time the old heater coughed and died in the middle of winter. And yet he carried that fragile hope as if it were a light in his hand, too small to warm him fully, but enough to guide him through the dark. Inside the restaurant, shadows leaned long across polished wood, and candle flames trembled like small promises waiting to be kept. Daniel smoothed his shirt with rough palms, the fabric thin and worn, but pressed carefully, as though love alone could turn it into something finer. He was not a man who belonged to luxury, and yet tonight he wanted to believe he could belong to someone. Each step toward the table by the window echoed in his chest, reminding him of everything he had given up, dreams of companionship, nights of laughter, mornings of gentle voices, and how long it had been since anyone had chosen to stay. He had not come for himself alone. Emma's tiny voice had pushed him here, her words soft but insistent. "Daddy, you need a friend." He could still feel the pat of her little hand on his cheek, her wide eyes filled with the kind of faith children give freely. She believed he deserved happiness, and so tonight he chose to believe her. He sat, fingers brushing the edge of the menu, calculating silently how to stretch $50 into something that looked effortless. The hum of conversation surrounded him, warm and distant, like a world he used to know but had long since fallen away from. Time passed, and the seat across from him remained empty. And with each creak of the door, hope rose and fell, leaving traces of longing behind. Minutes bled into one another, the promise of company dissolving with every glance at his phone. And then came the message. A cruel joke disguised as words, sharp enough to split his heart open without a sound. "I was just messing with you. Not worth the Uber." For a moment, the room spun. The glass in his hand trembled, and he swallowed hard against the ache of humiliation pressing hot against his chest. The world carried on. Laughter, silverware, the clink of wine glasses, as though his pain was invisible. He straightened his back the way he always did when Emma asked if everything would be okay, masking the weight with borrowed strength. But inside, something cracked, and the silence of being unwanted wrapped itself around him like a second skin. Still, he did not leave. Something in him whispered that showing up, even if only to heartbreak, mattered more than retreating. Perhaps the healing began not in being chosen, but in refusing to disappear. Across the room, unseen eyes were watching. Victoria Sterling, the woman who built empires and hid her loneliness behind glass towers, saw him, really saw him, in the dim glow of the restaurant. She noticed the tremor in his jaw, the quiet discipline in his posture, the stubborn courage of a man who stayed even when abandoned. And though she had told herself she had no space for softness, something in his quiet presence tugged at a place she thought long gone. If you feel the touch of this story in your own heart, if you've ever known the sting of being unseen or the quiet courage of still showing up, I invite you to walk with us through this journey. Leave a thought in the comments, share your story of resilience, and if this tale offers a moment of light in your day, Let your support be the healing thread that helps weave more stories like this. A simple like, a quiet subscription, or even the smallest word below can mean more than you realize. It keeps alive the fragile fire of hope we all carry. And as Daniel sat by that window, unaware that kindness was already crossing the room toward him, the story of his night was about to shift. The next chapter was not written in loneliness, but in the gentle miracle of being seen, and the flicker of something he thought had been lost forever. Daniel lingered at the table, his heart still caught in the sting of the cruel message, yet his body refused to move. Pride whispered to him to rise, to walk out before anyone noticed, but a deeper voice urged him to stay, as though leaving would mean surrendering the last fragile piece of hope. He reached for his glass, finding only water at the bottom. The faint fizz of melting ice, a hollow comfort against the hunger twisting in his chest. The napkin on his lap felt heavy, useless, a symbol of a meal never shared. Still, he pressed his shoulders tall the way he always did for Emma, because to collapse would mean letting despair win. The restaurant glowed with warmth, laughter circling from table to table, yet Daniel sat in the stillness of his own silence. He thought of Emma's drawings taped along the refrigerator at home, crayon houses with yellow doors, stick figures always smiling. She believed in a happiness he could barely imagine for himself, a healing kind of happiness that belonged to people who hadn't been left behind. Tonight, he wished he could borrow her belief, just for a while. Victoria watched, her gaze drawn again and again to the man by the window. She noticed the way his hand lingered on his phone, not to call, but to remind himself he hadn't been forgotten by the world entirely. She recognized the subtle tightening of his jaw, the kind of restraint born from years of carrying burdens without complaint. He wasn't loud in his pain, and yet it filled the space around him with an honesty she could not turn away from. Something inside her, long shielded by the armor of boardrooms and deadlines, stirred in recognition. Her wine remained untouched as she made her decision. When the server passed, she leaned in, her voice soft but certain, and ordered a plate of the house pasta and a glass of sparkling lemonade. She slid her card across without hesitation, her pulse quickening with an urgency she hadn't known in years. It wasn't charity. It was an offering, a reminder, perhaps even for herself, that kindness was still possible. Daniel startled when the plate was set before him, steam rising in gentle curls, carrying the scent of garlic and herbs. Confusion furrowed his brow. "I didn't order this," he murmured, his voice caught between apology and disbelief. The server offered the line rehearsed for him. "It's been taken care of, sir. Someone requested it for you. The bill is already settled." For a long moment, Daniel could only stare, suspicion flickering like a shadow. Too often life had offered him cruelty dressed as care. But before the doubt could close in, her voice reached him. "It's not charity," Victoria said, stepping closer, her tone even, steady, carrying the warmth of truth. "It's a reminder. You deserve to eat, even if the world tries to tell you otherwise." Daniel turned, eyes wide, meeting her gaze for the first time. She stood in quiet elegance, her blazer fitted but softened by the ease of her posture, her hair pinned back as though she had not meant to impress anyone, only to be present. There was no pity in her eyes, no sharp edge of superiority. Instead, he saw a calm honesty, a healing kind of presence that asked for nothing, yet gave everything in its certainty. His throat tightened, words failing him. For years he had endured being told to endure more, to toughen, to make do. Never once had he been told he deserved something as simple as this, a warm meal and the dignity it carried. She gestured to the chair opposite him. "May I?" The softness in her tone held no doubt that she would sit, but the courtesy mattered. He nodded, still dazed, and she slipped into the seat across from him with the ease of someone who had already chosen to stay. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet between them was not heavy, but alive, threaded with the faint fizz of the lemonade and the hush of conversation around them. Daniel's hand hovered above the fork, hesitant, as though accepting the food meant accepting a kindness he wasn't sure how to hold. "You didn't have to," he managed at last, his voice low, fragile. "I know," she answered simply, her eyes steady on his. "That's why it matters." The words sank deep, rippling through him like a stone dropped into still water. He picked up the fork, tentative, and brought the first bite to his lips. Warmth spread through his chest, not just from the food, but from the truth of her gesture. Each taste reminded him that he was seen, no longer invisible. It was healing, subtle but profound, like a breath after years of holding it in. His eyes lifted to hers again, and for a moment the noise of the restaurant faded until it was only the two of them, strangers drawn together not by design but by the quiet miracle of compassion. Victoria leaned back, watching him with a calm that carried no demand. She did not push conversation, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply let him eat, let him breathe, let him remember what it felt like to share a table. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, curious, without intrusion. "Long day?" He gave a small nod, a rough smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Most of them are." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "I know the feeling," and she left it there, enough to acknowledge his weariness without pressing him to expose it. The conversation that followed was light, circling around the music playing overhead, the fickle Boston weather, the rumor that the pasta recipe belonged to the owner's grandmother. It wasn't flirtation, nor was it interrogation. It was presence, simple and steady, the kind that nourished more deeply than any lavish words. For Daniel, it was enough. More than enough. By the time his plate was empty, he felt a weight lifting, replaced by something warmer, something healing. He had not been rescued. He had not been pitied. He had been seen. And for a man who had lived in the shadow of invisibility for too long, that was everything. Victoria reached into her blazer pocket and slid a card across the table. The candlelight caught the ink of her name, bold against the white. "I come here often," she said, her tone light, without pressure. "Sometimes for the coffee, never for the company. But if you ever feel like being seen again, you know where to find me." Before he could reply, she stood, her glass of wine untouched, and gave him a small nod that was neither farewell nor promise, but something in between. She walked away with quiet certainty, leaving him with the weight of her words and the warmth of a meal that tasted like dignity. Daniel sat alone once more, but he no longer felt abandoned. He traced the edges of the card with trembling fingers, his chest full, his heart steadier. For the first time in years, he carried more than survival with him. He carried the knowledge that he had been noticed, chosen, if only for an evening. And as he stepped into the cold night air, the echo of her voice lingered, a healing thread weaving itself into the fabric of his weary soul, guiding him quietly toward what would come next. A week later, the morning light in Boston stretched pale and golden across the narrow streets, melting the last traces of frost clinging to rooftops. Daniel pushed open the glass door of a small cafe tucked between the library and an old row of brick buildings, a place he rarely allowed himself to enter except on the rare days when his budget permitted a modest coffee. The air inside carried the comforting scent of cinnamon, roasted beans, and something softer, almost like belonging. He held his worn wallet in one hand, fingers brushing the folded bills he had carefully counted, reminding himself to stay within the fragile limits of what he could afford. Before he could order, a voice, calm and certain, drifted from behind him. "Make it 2, and add oat milk to his." He froze, surprised by the familiarity of the words. The barista nodded without hesitation, already ringing it up, and pointed toward the far corner of the cafe. Daniel turned, and there she was, Victoria, sitting near the window with her laptop open, sleeves of her blazer rolled just enough to soften her polished edges. Sunlight fell across her face, catching strands of hair that had slipped loose, making her look less like the CEO who had saved empires and more like someone simply choosing to spend her morning among ordinary lives. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. Perhaps what had happened at the restaurant was a kindness bound to one night, nothing more. But when the barista handed him the cup and gestured toward her table, his steps moved before his doubts could stop them. He approached quietly, setting the cup down in front of her, his voice low, tinged with both gratitude and disbelief. "You remembered my coffee." Her eyes lifted, steady and calm, meeting his with a warmth that disarmed him. "I remembered your courage," she replied. The coffee was the easy part. The words slipped into him like sunlight through a window long shut, thawing a place inside that had grown cold with years of being overlooked. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, and for a moment they simply sat together, sipping their drinks while the hum of conversation filled the space between. The healing presence of her silence was a balm in itself. For once, Daniel didn't feel the need to explain who he was or who he wasn't. He was simply allowed to be. Victoria broke the silence first, her lips curving with quiet amusement. "You know, my team botched an entire campaign last month, tried to launch a toddler snack line, and the slogan ended up sounding like we were advertising chewing gum for babies." Daniel blinked, then laughed, a sound unguarded, genuine. "That sounds like something my daughter's teacher would complain about." Her laugh followed, lighter than he imagined she was capable of, the sound wrapping around him like a small gift. "A food blogger roasted us online. The meme went viral. My board still hasn't let me live it down." She spoke not with arrogance, not with self-pity, but with the ease of someone who had learned to laugh at her own mistakes. The weight Daniel carried into the cafe began to ease, bit by bit. She wasn't interrogating him about his struggles, wasn't dissecting his choices, wasn't offering pity. She was simply sharing herself, flawed and human, and it made the air between them softer. For the first time in years, he felt laughter settle into his bones without guilt, without apology. They spoke of simple things, their coffee preferences, the strange mood swings of Boston weather, childhood snacks they both remembered with nostalgia, The conversation flowed like water, without effort, surprising them both with how natural it felt. Daniel found himself leaning forward, forgetting the constant calculation of dollars and hours that usually defined his days. In her presence, time loosened its grip, and he felt himself remembering what it meant to simply enjoy a moment. When he finally stood to leave, he half expected her to hand him another card, to attach meaning heavier than the morning could bear. But she only gave him a soft smile, a nod, and let him walk away freely. That freedom was its own kind of healing. As he stepped back into the sharp bite of winter air, he realized he was smiling too. Not because he had been saved, not because someone had shown him pity, but because someone had chosen to sit with him, to share laughter, and to remember him without asking for anything in return. Days turned into weeks, and their paths crossed again. Sometimes it was by design, sometimes by chance, but each meeting carried the quiet weight of inevitability. One morning she sent him a message, short, almost casual, but layered with meaning. Thought this might align with your world. No pressure. Attached was a digital pass to a workshop on early childhood nutrition hosted by Sterling Organics. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a professional. He was only a father who had learned to stretch every dollar into something that could feed his little girl. But her words, no pressure, were enough to push him to show up. The conference room buzzed with professionals, pediatricians, young mothers, students scribbling notes. Daniel sat near the back, unsure of his place, until the speaker asked for questions. Before he realized it, his hand rose. What about single parents who don't have time to cook everything fresh? His voice was steady, though tinged with raw honesty. Sometimes the choice is between frozen dinners or nothing. What should we really look for on labels when both time and money are against us? The room grew still. The speaker paused, then smiled, answering with unexpected respect. Later, when Daniel noticed a flaw in an allergy label, the expert stopped mid-sentence to acknowledge it. Heads turned toward him with recognition, not of pity, but of value. Victoria sat quietly in the back, watching, her arms folded across her blazer. She had seen ambition in boardrooms, cleverness in interns, expertise in professionals, but what she witnessed in Daniel was something rarer, authenticity born from love. When the session ended, he slipped out quickly, avoiding the cluster of business cards and polished conversations. His steps carried him toward the library, where Emma often waited after school. Inside, the smell of paper and polished wood wrapped him in a sense of safety. Emma sat cross-legged in the children's corner, her tiny fingers flipping pages of a picture book. The moment she saw him, she leapt into his arms, her laughter muffling the weariness of his day. Victoria followed, curious but cautious. Emma noticed her first, peeking shyly over her father's shoulder. She slipped from Daniel's arms, tugging his sleeve, and approached the elegant woman with wide eyes. Her tiny fingers touched the edge of Victoria's coat. "She smells like Mommy," she whispered with the innocence of a child. The air stilled. Daniel froze, his chest tightening, unsure how to shield his daughter or the woman standing before them. Victoria's composure faltered. Slowly, she crouched, meeting Emma's gaze with tenderness she hadn't allowed herself in years. "That's a big compliment," she said softly. "Your mummy must have smelled like kindness." Emma nodded, satisfied, before skipping back toward her books. Daniel's eyes shimmered, his throat tight. "She doesn't usually say things like that," he whispered. Victoria looked at him then, truly looked, and in that unguarded moment something shifted. It wasn't planned, wasn't spoken, but it was undeniable. And as Daniel held Emma close again, the warmth of healing love began to weave between the three of them, threading its way quietly into the fabric of their days, carrying them gently toward what waited beyond. The rhythm of their lives began to change quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the slow unfurling of spring after a long and bitter winter. Victoria's presence no longer belonged to fleeting evenings or casual encounters. It began to root itself into the fabric of Daniel's days, into the laughter of Emma's afternoons, into the softened silence of nights once filled only with weariness. She would arrive without fanfare, sometimes carrying a bag of groceries, sometimes just her calm composure, but always with a warmth that settled the air in their small apartment. Emma greeted her with the unguarded joy of a child who recognized a friend not by name but by heart. It wasn't planned. There was no declaration, no formal agreement. Yet soon it became natural for Daniel to hear a gentle knock on his door when his shifts ran late, or to see Emma sitting cross-legged on the floor with coloring books, while Victoria listened patiently to her stories. Sometimes she would sit beside Daniel at the worn kitchen table, reviewing a product design or a campaign idea, asking for his thoughts with genuine curiosity. He answered not with polished words, but with the straightforward honesty of a man who had lived in the real weight of scarcity. And she valued those answers, carrying them back into her boardrooms, where his voice, though absent, began to ripple through decisions that affected thousands of families. Emma's trust was a fragile treasure, and yet she gave it to Victoria with ease. On evenings, when bedtime came too soon, she would tug Victoria's sleeve and ask for 2 stories instead of 1, curling into the comfort of her voice, as though it had always belonged in their home. Daniel would watch from the doorway, his chest tightening with gratitude he could not articulate. There was a healing quality in seeing his daughter's eyes sparkle with joy again, as though the shadows of absence that had long lingered in their lives were finally receding. Then came a night that carved itself into memory. Emma had fallen ill, her small body trembling with fever, her skin too warm beneath Daniel's anxious hand. He hurried between the kitchen, where soup simmered on the stove, and the couch, where Emma lay curled under a blanket, her breaths shallow. Worry clawed at him. He had managed every hardship alone, but sickness always unearthed the raw fear of helplessness. The knock on the door was soft, almost hesitant, but when he opened it, Victoria was there, her expression steady, though her eyes softened at the sight of his distress. She stepped inside without waiting for permission, setting her bag on the counter and kneeling beside the little girl. With quiet precision, she drew out a folded cloth and a small vial of lavender oil. She soaked the fabric, pressed it cool and fragrant across Emma's forehead, and the child's body relaxed almost instantly. Daniel's breath caught, his relief fragile but real, as if her presence alone had eased the air in the room. And then she began to hum. The sound was gentle, low, carrying the tender cadence of a lullaby. At first, it seemed only a melody chosen at random, but the moment it reached Daniel's ears, he froze. He knew that song. His late wife had sung it countless nights, weaving silly words into it to coax laughter through Emma's tears. Hearing it now cracked something deep within him, a door he had long kept locked. His knees buckled, and he sank into the armchair, head in his hands, shoulders trembling as years of suppressed grief spilled free. The healing he had resisted suddenly demanded release, and he could no longer hold it back. Victoria's voice wavered for a heartbeat when she noticed his tears, but she did not stop. She kept singing until Emma's breathing softened into sleep, her small chest rising and falling in the peace of slumber. Only then did she look toward Daniel. He tried to form an apology, to explain why hearing that song had undone him, but the words tangled in his throat. "You couldn't have known," he whispered at last, his voice raw. She shook her head gently, her eyes glistening though she held them steady. "I didn't have to know. Some things find their way back on their own." The silence that followed was full, not heavy, but alive with memory, loss, and something new settling quietly between them. There was no confession, no dramatic vow, only the undeniable truth of what was forming in the space they shared. Daniel felt it in the weight of her gaze, in the calm steadiness of her hand, resting lightly on the blanket that covered his daughter, in the quiet certainty that she was no longer a visitor in their lives, but a part of them. From that night forward, the rhythm of their days deepened. Victoria still asked for his thoughts on labels and campaigns. Daniel still leaned on her when long hours pulled him away. Emma still looked for her at bedtime, expecting her presence as naturally as she expected her father's. And though none of them spoke the word, anyone watching could see what had begun to grow. The separate lives of three people, once fragile and unconnected, were weaving themselves into something resembling a family. Yet, as often happens with lives that find healing, change was not far behind. One afternoon, Daniel opened a plain white envelope that carried the weight of possibility and the sting of fear. Inside was a letter, a scholarship, a training program in Oregon, 1 year long, offering a certification that could transform his career and secure Emma's future. His chest swelled with pride, but almost immediately that pride collapsed into dread. Opportunity, he knew, often came at the cost of what he loved most. For 3 days he carried the letter folded in his pocket, its edges softening beneath his restless touch. Every glance at Emma's smile, every moment of quiet shared with Victoria, pressed harder against him. When at last he told them, sitting on a park bench while Emma chased bubbles across the grass, his voice carried the tension of both joy and sorrow. "I got the scholarship," he confessed, the words thick in his throat. "It's in Oregon, a year away." The silence that followed was broken only by the laughter of a child, light and fleeting against the weight of his news. Daniel's eyes dropped, bracing for disappointment, for the inevitable fracture. But when he looked up, Victoria's gaze held no anger, no judgment, only clarity and warmth. "Loving someone doesn't mean holding them," she said softly. "It means not clipping their wings." The words pierced through him, leaving him undone. Where he expected resistance, she gave him freedom. Where he braced for loss, she offered love deeper than possession. And in that moment, he realized that what had grown between them was not fragile. It was strong enough to stretch across distance, strong enough to carry them forward. As evening fell, Emma tugged at his hand, holding up the last bubble wand with a grin. Daniel smiled, though his heart was heavy, and glanced at Victoria. In her steady gaze, he saw not the end of something precious, but the beginning of a love that would endure even the longest miles. The healing he once thought impossible now lived in every breath, every promise, every unspoken vow. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The path before them shimmered with both challenge and hope, carrying them toward the next chapter of their story. The days that followed took on the hush of a sacred countdown, each sunrise a soft tear from the paper chain Emma had taped along the narrow hallway. 52 links, like tiny promises, one for each week he would be gone. They made it together at the kitchen table, the three of them leaning close beneath the amber glow of a crooked lamp. Emma's little hands folding strips of coloured paper with solemn care, Daniel writing small notes inside, jokes, memories, a line from a lullaby, before she looped them into circles, and Victoria, steady and precise, adding a dab of glue and pressing each link shut as if sealing something holy. When the chain finally stretched from the doorframe to the bookshelf, Emma stood back, lips parted in awe. "It looks like a rainbow that knows where it's going," she whispered. Daniel swallowed, nodding, because it was easier than saying the truth out loud, that the rainbow would reach its last colour without him there to see it. They didn't pretend distance would be easy. On the couch, with Emma asleep against his chest, Daniel told Victoria how silence could be a wilderness if you let it, how absence had a way of making every shadow feel like a question. She listened, her gaze calm, then pressed 2 fingers lightly to his wrist, finding the pulse there as if to anchor him. "We won't let silence be empty," she said. "We'll fill it on purpose." It was not grand or glittering, that promise, but it was the kind that endures. He felt something loosen inside his ribs, a quiet untying of fear. Departure came the way departures often do, on a Thursday, when the city pretended it was just another day. Their apartment smelled of simmered tomatoes and basil because Emma had requested fancy pasta like the first night, insisting they eat by candlelight though it was still early evening. Victoria humoured the ceremony, placing forks just so, letting Emma carry the matches with grave importance while Daniel set 3 plates at the small table by the window. They ate slowly, stopping often to memorize each other's faces. Words behaved shyly. Laughter rose and fell like gentle tides. When the candles were almost stubs, Emma fetched a shoebox from under her bed and set it in Daniel's lap. Inside were drawings, 3 stick figures beneath a yellow door, a lady with long hair and a doctor coat for Daniel, because she thought white coats mean heroes, and a lumpy heart the size of both her hands. "It's for packing," she said, tapping the cardboard wall. "So you never run out of home." Night deepened. They sat on the floor with cups of tea while the paper chain whispered overhead whenever a draught drifted through the hallway. Daniel cupped Victoria's cheek, amazed again by the softness of her there, the steady light in her eyes. He wanted to say 100 fluttering things, how her presence turned rooms into sanctuary, how her laughter had become a sound his body recognized like breath. But the words that came were simpler, truer. "You changed the shape of my life," he murmured. She smiled, and in that smile he saw the quiet bravery of a woman who had learned to love without cages. "Then keep its wings," she answered. The airport was rain-washed and bright, that particular brightness airports have when they swallow tears and send them into the clouds. Emma clung to his neck, whispering the rules she had invented to make the world fair. "You have to wear the blue socks on test days because blue is confident, and when it gets lonely, you play the song." He nodded solemnly, promising to obey, and kissed her temple in that lingering way that made her quiet against his shoulder. Victoria stood a step away, not intruding, fingers entwined before her like someone holding a prayer. When he turned to her, the noise fell away. There were no speeches, no cinematic goodbyes. She only slid a small envelope into his palm. "Open it on the plane," she said, voice low, steady. "Not before." He slipped it into his pocket like a talisman and memorized the warm brown flecks in her eyes, the calm line of her mouth, the way her breath trembled only once before it steadied. On the plane, above a quilt of clouds, he opened the envelope. Inside, a single photograph of the three of them at the kitchen table beneath the crooked lamp, Emma's tongue peeking out with concentration as she pressed a link shut, Victoria glancing sideways at Daniel, her expression unguarded, tenderness caught in flight. On the back, one line in her looping hand: "Hearts don't care about distance. They know the way home." He pressed the card flat against his chest, closed his eyes, and let the engine's steady hum braid itself with the memory of her voice. Oregon was a different kind of winter, pine-scented, wide-skied, rain that fell like patient stitching. The hospital where he trained smelled of disinfectant and coffee at ungodly hours. He learned the rhythms of machines, the vernacular of nurses who could make a joke in the middle of a crisis and mean it, the way hope looked on a pulse ox screen. He slept too little and wrote too much, filling a notebook with lists, dosages, procedures, Emma's latest malapropisms, recipes Victoria texted when he admitted his dinners were becoming a rotation of toast. He bought a second-hand kettle and a cheap pan that hissed angrily every time he tried to make eggs, and he laughed at it alone in his studio apartment, the sound oddly freeing. Nights were for phone calls. Emma insisted on story time on speaker, so he read from the same dog-eared book until the paper softened like cloth, changing voices for each character while she giggled and requested the silly one again. When she fell asleep, he stayed on the line with Victoria. They learned the map of each other's days by detail, not spectacle, the way rain slowed traffic outside his window, the new intern at Sterling Organics who said "like" so often it became a punctuation, the patient who'd asked for extra blankets, not because she was cold, but because weight made her feel safe. They did not try to fix each other's tiredness. They simply shared it until it halved. Across the distance, their breathing found a common tempo. There were hard days that tested the seams. A lab practical went wrong, and the jitter of failure clung to him like static. He wanted to slam a door, to shake off the old fear that he didn't belong in rooms where precision mattered. He sent one text, "Bad day," and within minutes his phone lit up with an incoming video call. Victoria, face bare of its usual armor, lay on her couch beneath a navy throw, city lights smudging the window behind her. "Sit with me," she said. They didn't speak much. She moved the camera until he could see only an angled square of lamplight and her hand resting open on the cushion. His own hand exhaled on the quilt of his bed, palm up, as if to meet it. Tears came without drama, the kind that don't beg for notice, and afterward he slept. There were good days that glowed like small lanterns. He aced a difficult rotation. A nurse with 30 years on the floor clapped him on the back and said, "You're steady, kid." He sent Victoria a picture of his pass badge with a grinning caption. She replied with the photo of a prototype pouch for a new toddler puree. No dyes, clear labeling, a gentle line drawing of a spoon and a hand. "Honest food," she wrote. He caught himself grinning at his phone on a bus full of strangers and didn't care who saw. Packages travelled both ways across the miles, little bridges wrapped in brown paper. He sent a tin of Oregon Marionberry jam and a pine cone Emma would want to sniff. She sent coffee beans from the tiny cafe by the library and a scarf that smelled faintly of her perfume. Emma's envelopes were masterpieces of crayon and stickers, a dinosaur family eating spaghetti, a map where Boston and Oregon were connected by a purple road sprinkled with stars, a drawing of the paper chain almost gone now. Each arrival was a soft knock at the door of his patience, a reminder that time was still moving, carrying him toward return. He learned to keep company with quiet. In the gap between evening shifts and midnight study, he would brew tea in the dented kettle and stand at the narrow window, watching rain silver the parking lot lights. Silence no longer felt like an enemy. It was a room he could sit in, where grief and gratitude could both breathe. Sometimes he played the lullaby, the one that had broken him open the night Emma spiked a fever. He let it move through the studio in a low thread, not to reopen wounds, but to remind him that love had stitched itself into the very seams of his life, and stitches hold. Back in Boston, the paper chain shortened with ceremony. Every Sunday, Emma climbed onto a chair and tore one ring free with theatrical flourish. Victoria kept each link in a glass jar on the bookshelf, the strips curling like small smiles, a chronicle of vanishing distance. When the chain halved, she texted Daniel a photo of the hallway with a caption, "We're closer than we've ever been." He stared at it a long time, the grin he didn't bother to hide tugging at his mouth. Not all days were brave. There were mornings when he woke with an ache that had no single name, just an accumulation of missed touch, the familiar weight of Emma against his side during cartoons, the curve of Victoria's palm smoothing his tie, the wordless comfort of cooking in shared silence. He let the ache be a teacher rather than a tyrant, and on those days he wrote letters by hand, clumsy, careful letters about the way the janitor whistled off key down the corridor, about a patient who kept a notebook of jokes to give away, about a stray cat that lived near the loading dock. He mailed them even when a text would have been faster, because ink travelled slower and somehow landed deeper. Spring unbuttoned the winter's coat. In Oregon, cherry trees erupted into shy clouds. In Boston, sidewalks filled again with chalk hopscotch and strollers. Daniel learned the faces of his cohort the way soldiers learn platoons, by shorthand, by habit, by trust you don't call dramatic names. He watched two new fathers on the ward crying quietly for different reasons. One from relief, one from goodbye. Life and loss kept sharing the same elevator. He found that he could hold both without breaking. As months rounded the corner into summer, something inside him grew steady as a heartbeat. The work sharpened him, but didn't hollow him out. He stood taller without noticing. On a muggy Thursday, he received an evaluation with a single sentence that made his throat close. Carter demonstrates dignity-forward care. He read it 3 times and sent a photo to Victoria. The typing dots pulsed, then her reply arrived. "That's the man I saw the first night." He closed his eyes, letting the truth rise like a tide. Toward autumn, the program director took him aside, a hand heavy on his shoulder. "You're made for this. Ever think about the pediatrics wing?" He did, immediately seeing Emma's eyes in every small face, feeling his chest flood with purpose so swift it startled him. That night, he told Victoria on a call while Emma sang nonsense songs in the background, as if scoring their lives with an orchestra of happy accidents. "Say yes," Victoria said softly. "Say yes to the rooms where you are already love." He did. The last quarter of the year travelled with the quick, breathless gait of a runner who can see the finish line. In the hallway jar, only 12 paper links remained, then 10, then 8. Emma drew a calendar with stars marking Daddy Days and put it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a pear. Victoria started leaving her office earlier, choosing to walk home along streets where trees were turning the colour of old coins. On one such evening, she passed the little restaurant with the navy linens and the soft lamps. Through the window, tables glimmered. She paused on the sidewalk, one hand on the doorframe as though feeling for a pulse. The memory of a man alone by the glass came back like a photograph someone slid across a table. She smiled, small and private. The past had not vanished. It had offered a doorway. A storm came through Oregon the week the jar in Boston held 3 links. The wind rattled his studio window. Rain thrashed the city into a hush. On his break, he stood in the supply closet, the only loud place rendered quiet by the storm, and dialed. When Victoria's face bloomed on his screen, he could see the reflection of the bookshelf behind her, the jar of paper curls catching lamplight like tiny seashells. 3, she said, holding up fingers. He laughed, unexpectedly bright. 3, he echoed, and they stayed on the line without needing to narrate the shared fact that sometimes the last miles are the longest. The week of 2 links, he bought a new shirt. Not expensive, nothing about him was showy, but pressed as carefully as the old one he had worn the first night, stitched with the kind of respect he had finally learned to give himself. He folded it into his duffel along with a small box he had purchased from a jeweller whose hands shook when he wrapped it, either with age or empathy. Daniel couldn't tell which, and didn't need to. The box wasn't about money. It was about something he wanted to say without tripping the words. On the final evening, the program held a small ceremony in a room that smelled like lemon polish and pride. Certificates changed hands. Hands found each other in claps and embraces. Someone punched "Don't Stop Believin'" into a portable speaker, and miraculously, no one groaned. When it ended, he didn't linger. Outside, the sky had the rinsed blue look of a day forgiven. He took a taxi to the airport and sat at the gate with his shoebox of drawings tucked into his carry-on, running his thumb over the lumpy heart until it warmed under his skin. At 30,000 feet, he reread the note on the back of the photograph. Hearts don't care about distance, and felt the sentence settle in like a key turning. He dozed and woke to sun shouldering the horizon, a thin seam of gold. Somewhere below, the city waited with its beloved noise. Somewhere, a hallway carried the hush of a paper chain's last unbroken link. Somewhere, a woman who had learned to stay was sliding on a navy dress that caught the light, steadying her breath for a moment she had never tried to choreograph. The plane began its descent. Seatbelts clicked. Wheels found asphalt with a forgiving shudder. He stood when the aisle started to shuffle, his body moving with the surety of someone walking toward the shape of his life as it was always meant to be. In his pocket, the small box pressed a gentle square against his palm, a quiet drum. He smiled, and the smile didn't wobble. The doors opened to a rush of air that smelled like jet fuel and home. He stepped into it, feeling the whole year gather behind him, not as weight, but as wings, and walked toward what waited beyond the sliding glass, where love, patient and bright, was already making room for the next beginning. The terminal doors breathed open, and Boston stepped forward to meet him. Wet streetlight on polished floors, a tumble of voices layered with announcements, the familiar perfume of coffee and jet fuel. Daniel moved with the unhurried certainty of someone returning to the shape of his life, duffel strap snug across his shoulder, the small velvet box a calm square against his palm. He scanned the crowd only once before he saw them. Emma, in a yellow sweater with tiny embroidered stars, hopping in place to keep from exploding, and beside her, Victoria, still and bright like a lighthouse, holding the last paper link in her hand as if it were a flower. Emma launched first. She hit him with both arms and all her little weight, and he laughed into her hair, a laugh he hadn't been able to make in a year, the kind that came from a place behind the ribs. "You're taller," he murmured, kissing the crown of her head. "You're real," she said into his collar, as if answering a different question. When he lifted his gaze, Victoria was there, close enough for the air between them to feel warm. They didn't try for eloquence. She set the last ring of paper into his palm and threaded her fingers through his free hand, as if resuming a sentence neither had finished. The years in her eyes, years of building, choosing, staying, softened into something like relief. He watched that relief arrive and settle, and in the quiet of that settling, their bodies remembered where to stand. Outside, winter had loosened its teeth. A bright wind rushed down the taxi line and caught Emma's giggle, tossing it up like a kite. They climbed into the back seat together. The driver adjusted the mirror and smiled in that way people do when they love reunions, when they've been paid to witness them. Buildings streamed by like a deck of cards being turned, and the three of them sat with knees touching, sharing the same square of moving sunlight, the joy almost shy in its tenderness. When the cab turned onto their street, his street again, the old elms stood on guard the way they always had, their high branches opening like pages. The apartment welcomed him with the silence of things that have waited well. On the bookshelf, the glass jar full of curled paper links, soft spirals of colour, catching lamp glow. On the refrigerator, the calendar Emma had made, each square crossed through to this day with a green crayon that had been pressed so hard the paper bore little valleys. On the kitchen table, a small bouquet of grocery store tulips standing up bravely in a jar that once held pickles. His coat hit the old chair just inside the door, and his shoulders dropped as if unclasped. He was home. They did not make a feast. They reheated soup and sliced bread thick and careless, exactly the way a good first night should eat. Emma presented him with her news in breathless chapters, how the neighbour's cat had learned to sit when offered string cheese, how the librarian now kept a shelf called Emma's Special Picks, how the dentist had given her a sticker that said, "Courage," and she had stuck it to the bottom of her shoe because that's where courage lives when you run. Every few sentences she would reach for him again, just to make sure he was still there. When she finally slept, star sweater tangled at her waist, they stood at the bedroom doorway for a long minute and watched her shoulders rise and fall, the steadiness of a child's breathing laying balm over the day. Victoria leaned her head to his shoulder. He kissed her hairline, slow and grateful, and felt something unknit and smooth inside him. They did not speak of the box in his pocket. They did not need to. There is a way love learns to be patient without becoming timid. They let the moment be itself, wide and bright and unadorned, and moved back to the kitchen where the kettle made a small, faithful noise. He poured, she sweetened, and they took their mugs to the window and stood hip to hip, looking out at the ink-dark street, letting the old radiator's hum play the simple music of return. Morning rose kind and ordinary. He woke to the sound of Emma's whisper prayer to the ceiling, something about pancakes, and that if Jesus was available for breakfast, he could come, but only if he brought syrup. And he lay there, smiling at the ceiling, because this was the country he belonged to. Laughter and small bargains and the soft thunder of feet. The first light combed their rooms with pale gold, and he knew, deep as bone, that he had not been given back the life he left. He had been given this one, finer, because it had been stitched, piece by patient piece, across distance. He went to the hospital that week to sign his new badge and step into the corridors he had dreamed about. Pediatrics. He had said yes to the rooms where small hands trusted first and questions came out sideways. The wing smelled faintly of crayons and hand soap. He learned the names written in marker on paper clouds above beds. He learned how to kneel at eye level and let silence answer before he did. He learned that stickers given at the exact right moment could reset an entire day. Nurses he had never met before said, "Welcome home," like it was a medical order. In the evenings, the three of them made a life with the serene bravery of people who have already passed the hardest test. Some nights they cooked, and some nights they turned the couch into a ship and sailed it through a jungle of laundry. Victoria read aloud with a cadence that made even grocery lists sound like lullabies. Daniel fixed the cabinet hinge that had always sulked. Emma invented a new holiday called Tuesday Sparkle, on which all boredom could be banished by glitter glue, which meant the table lived under a galaxy for a week. They laughed more than they spoke. They touched more than they planned. Healing often sounds like that. Familiar, unremarkable, colossal. Victoria's world kept its own tempo. Meetings did not get shorter because love had gotten larger, and stairs did not become less steep because someone was waiting at the top. But the waiting, she found, had changed its weather. Walking into her office, she carried with her the particular quiet that follows a small hand pressed to your cheek. The company shifted. It was not something you could chart on a graph, though the graphs did begin to rise, but an ethical tilt, a willingness to tell the truth on the front of a box so that trust could start where shopping did. She had always built well. Now she built with tenderness as an ingredient, and the work tasted different. On a morning washed clean by overnight rain, she asked them to come by the building with the rooftop garden. "There's something I want you to see," she said, brushing hair from Emma's forehead and tucking it behind the little ear with a surety that made Daniel's chest ache in that good, inconvenient way. Emma insisted on changing into her special event dress, which was simply the blue one with the loose hem, because she believed buttons were applause. The elevator rode them up past floors full of quiet industry, past a reflection of themselves in the doors, man, woman, girl, the geometry of belonging, and opened into a wash of green and light. The rooftop was laced with rows of herbs and low trees in boxes. Bees worked with the perfect concentration of creatures who don't second-guess their purpose. At the far end, a small stage had been raised with a modest podium and a scatter of folding chairs. Boxed pouches lay arranged on a long table. Soft colors, clean lines, labels that spoke in plain sentences. Emma ran first. then remembered roofs have edges and ran back to wrap both hands around her father's. Victoria lingered, a faint flush in her cheeks, the only sign that this mattered to her more than she would let a boardroom see. Daniel picked up one of the pouches. He turned it over in his hands and felt a lift of pride he hadn't expected to feel for a thing you could buy. He read the tagline, "Gentle and true," and he understood that the line between what he did at a bedside and what she did at a drafting table had disappeared. It was all the same work, nourishment, dignity, the stubborn insistence that people deserve to be told the truth in words they can hold. When she stepped to the podium, employees and partners and a handful of media tilted their faces toward her. The city pressed near around them, 1,000 windows listening. Her voice moved across the chairs and over the herbs with ease. She spoke of hunger that isn't only stomach-deep, of parents who stand in grocery aisles translating labels into minutes and dollars, of how the smallest kindness scales when you make it a practice. At some point, her gaze found him. It stayed there the way a compass knows north. He felt the rooftop steady under his feet. Afterward, there were hands to shake and shoulders to clasp, and an investor with a wonderful habit of carrying peppermints who told Emma that anyone who could tie her own shoe was a born leader, and Emma took this as a formal designation. But the crowd began to melt like sugar into tea, and the garden grew quiet again, and the late afternoon stood around them with its soft wrists showing. Victoria crossed the space until she stood just close enough that he could count the gold threads where her dress caught the light. She reached into her pocket. Time, which had learned to be generous with them, widened. She did not kneel because she did not need the stage of it, and because she knew his knees had carried enough weight. She did not try for speech because the city was loud, and promises, when true, prefer simple sentences. The small box opened with a sound like a page turning. Inside, a ring, ordinary as a door and as welcome. "I don't want to save you," she said, voice low, certain the exact temperature of the day. "I just want to stay." It is possible for a human heart to nod before a head does, and his did. Without drama, with joy that ran quiet and deep, he answered with the yes that had been living in him for months, maybe since a plate of pasta arrived like mercy, maybe since a lullaby threaded the night back together. He said it again because some words deserve echo. Yes. They did not ask the rooftop to erupt for them. It did anyway, in small ways. The wind lifted and braided their hair. A bee, finished with a task, drew a soft, slow circle and left them without stinging. Somewhere down on a lower floor, someone laughed, the kind of laugh that means good news in a text, and the sound rose up and entered their moment without being invited, and fit anyway. Emma, having wandered just far enough to be dangerous, returned with her palms full of rosemary leaves. "Smell," she commanded, and they did, and in the green, clean scent was everything they'd chosen, the ordinary miracle of days, the brave quiet that love requires, the way a family invents itself by showing up. They went to dinner where everything had first cracked open. The hostess recognized Victoria and then recognized the way Daniel's hand was threaded with hers and decided to pretend she had known this all along. The table by the window waited like a kept promise. Candlelight gathered on the glass so that the city glanced in and saw itself gentler than it remembered being. They ordered what they wanted without apology. The server who had once delivered a meal to a man bracing for humiliation now placed plates before a family making holy work of eating slowly. Emma unfolded a drawing from her backpack and spread it across the runner. 3 figures at a table, a yellow door, a roof that curved like a smile. "This is us," she announced. It was not an argument. It was a map. They ate, they laughed, they let silence come, and did not fear what it might say. At some point the ring found her hand and learned its place there. At some point Daniel turned his palm up beneath the table, and she placed her hand in it, and 2 lives that had once been so practiced at loneliness forgot how to rehearse it. When they walked home under a sky the color of warm slate, the air felt newly brushed. Traffic made its usual noise, and the city's neon made its usual vows, and the 3 of them kept a pace that belonged to them alone. At the apartment door, Emma asked to be carried because her legs had suddenly remembered they were 5. He scooped her up and felt the old ache in his back, the old sweetness in his chest. Victoria fumbled for the key and found it with the muscle memory of belonging. Inside, the crooked lamp did what it had always done, made a small sun of a small room. They did not rush to sleep. They put on music low, the familiar lullaby rearranged for instruments neither of them could name. Emma lay on the rug and hummed along, eyes half closed, hands choreographing the air. Daniel leaned against the counter and watched the 2 people he loved move through the room as if the room belonged to them, because it did. He thought of the Oregon rain and the paper links and the jar of curled color and the line on the back of a photograph. He thought of wings. Later, when the lights went out, the city kept its glow at the edges of the curtains. He stood for a moment at the window and let his breath fog a small moon onto the glass, then drew a heart in it with his knuckle because some gestures deserved to be simple. Behind him, the bed creaked the way it always had, like a friendly thing clearing its throat. He turned back to that sound, to that life, to the next unremarkable miracle waiting with its sleeves rolled up. And in the morning, because beginnings prefer mornings, there would be a phone call from the hospital about a child who hated needles and needed a brave man to make the world less sharp, and an email about a partnership that would put clear labels on more boxes, and a note from the librarian about a book on hold for Emma that involved a dragon who refused to hoard gold because kindness was shinier. The day would be full, not loud. The day would be theirs. But for now, the night held them. Breath by breath, steady and healing, it stitched them into one story, readying the next page with the patience of love that knows how to wait and how to move, how to open the door and say, "Come in, sit down, we kept your seat." The following weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt almost too tender to be real. Each morning carried the quiet miracle of ordinary life, the hiss of the kettle, Emma's bright chatter about school, Victoria's laughter at some tiny domestic mishap, like Daniel burning toast because he had been too lost in watching them move across the kitchen. These moments stitched themselves into a tapestry that felt both healing and inevitable, a pattern of belonging too steady to be coincidence. Daniel had thought love might roar back into his life like a storm, but instead it returned like sunlight, persistent, gentle, making everything it touched warmer without demanding notice. At the hospital, he grew into his new role with a confidence that surprised him. Children greeted him with shy smiles, parents with tired gratitude. He learned to bend low to meet frightened eyes, to explain needles in the language of superheroes, to carry both sorrow and hope without letting one eclipse the other. At night, When he returned home, Emma would leap into his arms and ask about the children he had helped, listening with wide-eyed reverence, as though her father had gone to battle dragons and returned victorious. Victoria would watch them, a softness in her gaze that no boardroom could ever summon. She saw not only the healer in Daniel, but the man who had once been abandoned at a table and had chosen, against despair, to keep showing up. For Victoria, life in the world of sterling organics shifted, too. She began to lead with a gentler authority, weaving honesty into contracts, insisting that labels be clear enough for tired parents to trust. Her colleagues noticed the change. The CEO, who once wielded numbers like weapons, now carried compassion as a sharper tool. At night, she allowed herself to rest in the safety of their small apartment, where the crooked lamp lit her face in ways no spotlight ever had. Daniel often caught her staring at Emma, as though the little girl's laughter had reopened a room in her heart long locked. One evening, the three of them sat on the floor with crayons and blank paper. Emma drew a castle with 3 windows and explained solemnly that each window meant a heart. One for Daddy, one for Victoria, one for her. She added stars above, then scribbled a path that connected the door to a garden. "So no one gets lost," she said. Daniel's chest ached with the simple healing truth of it, that a child's drawing could hold the shape of the life he had always longed for. Victoria touched his hand lightly, and in that touch was a vow unspoken but undeniable. Seasons turned. Autumn gold gave way to winter hush, and then spring spilled green into their days. With each shift of the earth, their bond deepened. There were challenges, of course, nights when Emma's fever spiked and fear pressed heavy on Daniel's chest. Days when Victoria's board meetings left her weary and frayed. Yet instead of fracturing, those struggles bound them closer. They learned to lean gently instead of resist, to listen instead of retreat. Healing lived in those choices, the daily practice of love, patient and steadfast. It was during one of those evenings, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, that Daniel felt the certainty settle in him. Emma had fallen asleep, sprawled across both their laps, her small hand curled around Victoria's finger, as though claiming her beyond question. Candlelight flickered against the crooked lamp, and the city hummed faintly outside their window. Daniel looked at Victoria, really looked, and knew the truth had already been written in the way their lives had entwined. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing across her palm, and whispered with no grandeur, no hesitation, "This is home." She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with a warmth that carried both strength and surrender. No words were needed. The moment itself was the vow. And as the night deepened, as Emma's breathing steadied in the silence, they sat together in the healing quiet of a love that no longer questioned itself. It was not a rescue, not a fairy tale. It was something stronger, a choice renewed every day to stay, to believe, to build. And with that certainty resting between them like a steady flame, the story of their future began to unfold, carrying them softly toward the next chapter. Spring opened its hands fully, and the city breathed with blossoms. Trees lined the sidewalks in tender pinks and whites, the air fragrant with renewal. Daniel walked home beneath those trees one late afternoon, his white coat folded over his arm, his steps unhurried but steady. He had spent the day guiding frightened children through pain, comforting parents who clutched his hands with gratitude, and now, as he neared the apartment, he felt the anticipation of something even more sacred, family waiting behind a yellow door. Inside, the sound of Emma's laughter spilled out before he even turned the key. She was dancing in the middle of the living room, a paper crown perched crookedly on her head, declaring herself Queen of Tuesdays. Victoria was sitting cross-legged on the rug, a rare sight for a woman whose life had once been measured in contracts and boardrooms. She clapped in rhythm, her smile unguarded, and for a moment the room shimmered with a joy that was both healing and whole. When Daniel stepped in, Emma ran to him, crown tumbling, arms wide. He caught her easily, her small body warm against his chest. Over her shoulder, his eyes met Victoria's, and the world seemed to pause in the quiet acknowledgement of everything they had become. They cooked dinner together that night. Nothing elaborate, just pasta with tomato sauce, garlic bread toasted unevenly, and a bowl of strawberries Emma insisted on adding as dessert. The three of them moved around the kitchen with the rhythm of people who belonged to one another. Daniel stirring, Victoria slicing, Emma supervising. With a wooden spoon, she waved like a conductor's baton. Candlelight flickered on the table again, and it struck Daniel how much had changed since the night he had first sat alone by a restaurant window. Now there were no empty chairs, no silent waiting, no cruel messages glowing on his phone. Only warmth, only presence, only love. After dinner, they settled on the couch. Emma curled between them, her head in Daniel's lap, her feet pressed gently against Victoria's arm. She asked for a story, and Daniel began with the tale of a castle where kindness ruled, where doors always opened and no one was ever left outside. Victoria added details: gardens that grew food for all, a library with books that read themselves aloud. Emma's giggles wove through their words until her eyelids grew heavy, her breath softening into sleep. Daniel brushed her hair back tenderly, his hand lingering on the small rise and fall of her chest, and then looked at Victoria. She was already watching him, her gaze filled with that same calm certainty she had carried from the very first moment she had spoken to him across a crowded room. Later, when the apartment was quiet and Emma's crown lay forgotten on the rug, Daniel reached for Victoria's hand. They sat together at the kitchen table, the glow of the crooked lamp casting golden circles on the wood. He slid open the small velvet box he had carried for weeks. The ring was plain, unadorned, but it shone in the candlelight like a promise finally spoken aloud. His voice was steady, though his chest ached with the weight of everything that had led them here. "I don't want perfection," he said softly. "I only want this, us. Every morning, every night, every quiet moment in between." Victoria's eyes glistened, and she nodded before words could form. She reached across the table, her fingers closing around his, as if to anchor them both in that sacred stillness. There was no grand spectacle, no staged performance, only two souls choosing each other in the healing hush of an ordinary evening. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, and in the silence that followed, the world felt whole. From then on, life carried a new kind of fullness. The paper crown became a fixture at the dinner table. The crooked lamp glowed faithfully each night, bearing witness to laughter, to tears, to the sacred rhythm of belonging. Daniel walked the hospital corridors with the quiet pride of a man who knew love waited for him at home. Victoria led her company with the tenderness of someone who had learned that strength is found not in walls, but in open doors. and Emma, in her small but radiant way, reminded them daily that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the steady practice of showing up again and again with love. One summer evening, they returned to the restaurant where everything had begun. The same table by the window awaited them. This time, the chairs were full, the air bright with laughter, the food abundant. The server, who had once delivered a meal to a lonely man, now smiled knowingly at the family before him. Emma spread another drawing across the table. 3 stick figures beneath a roof with a yellow door, this time holding hands, the word "Home" scrawled above in bold letters. Daniel's eyes shimmered as he looked at it, then at the 2 faces before him. A year ago, he had walked into this place with only $50 and a fragile hope. Tonight, he sat with everything he had ever needed. And so their story, once written in shadows, unfolded now in light. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, but something far more enduring, a quiet miracle of love, healing, and the simple act of staying. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. A like or a simple subscription helps me continue to share these healing stories of love and second chances. Your support means more than you know, and together we can keep spreading the light of hope to others who need it most.